My name is Rich Hatfield. I work for the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. We're a nonprofit based in Portland, Oregon. We work on animal conservation through the preservation of invertebrates and their habitat. And for the last 7 years, I've been working almost full-time on bumblebee conservation, and sort of this concept of doing an atlas project in the Northwest has been on my radar for a long time, and was really pleased to be able to partner with the Idaho Fish and Game and the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife to put this project on. I've been telling people this for a few years now, but when I started working in pollinator conservation in the late 1990s, before colony collapse disorder and before most people knew what bees were for the most part. And if I wanted to have this many people in the room to talk about pollinator conservation, I would have had to flown people from all over the country to get people in the room. But here we are on a beautiful, sunny Saturday morning in May, and I've got a room full of people here, and close to 95 people signed up to watch this online. So we've come a long way in pollinator conservation, and we really couldn't do it without the awareness and participation of all of you. So thanks for being here. Thanks for spending your time with us. Thanks for volunteering for this project. I'm excited to get this off the ground and really start working. It's been all of this preparation, and now we're getting ready to launch. And so this is the first training we're doing anywhere. So you guys are our guinea pigs, which is a good thing. Just to lay some groundwork for the day, or some ground rules. I'm here for you. I'm going to talk a lot this morning. There's going to be a lot of sort of presentation, a lot of logistics, a lot of information. But I think it can become pretty easily overwhelming because there's so much material. So please, if you have questions, including online, please ask in real time if you can, and I'll try to address them as appropriate. I want this to be as much of a dialogue or more of a dialogue than me just presenting to you. I was a high school teacher for 9 years, so I'm perfectly used to being interrupted appropriately and inappropriately. So feel free to raise your hand and say, I don't understand, or can you go slower, or whatever, so that we can all be on the same page as we move forward. There is a lot of material today, so kind of hold on to your seats, and we'll get started. Maybe. This isn't going to work now. Okay. Ross, I don't seem to be able to advance my slides. Oh, there we go. So just so you all know, this is a collaboration between a bunch of people, or a bunch of organizations, including Idaho Fish and Game, Xerces Society, the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, the Oregon Bee Project, which is a collaboration between the Oregon Department of Agriculture and Oregon State University. And this project in the 3 states is funded by, some of it's funded by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service through a competitive state wildlife grant, and also through a grant from the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research. So a huge thank you to all of those folks. We wouldn't be here without them. I mentioned a little bit about the Xerces Society. We were founded in 1971 by a gentleman by the name of Bob Pyle, who is a pretty well-known lepidopterist, if you're into the butterflies at all. He lives in Washington State, and he founded the Xerces Society, and it's named after the Xerces blue butterfly, which was the first butterfly to go extinct because of human activity. It was native to the San Francisco Bay Area. And so in 1971, he started this organization all by himself. In the almost 50 years since then, we've expanded. We have over 50 folks working full-time on invertebrate conservation. We have offices all over the country. Most of our staff is based in Portland, Oregon, but we also have folks in the Midwest, in the Northeast, in the Southeast, in Texas, and in California. So, and we work on, the joke in the office is that we'll work on any animal without a backbone except a politician. Most of our work is in terrestrial environments and freshwater environments. We don't do a lot of saltwater work at this point. We have done some work on oil spills and stuff like that, but most of our work is with terrestrial and freshwater invertebrates. Today looks like this. There'll be about a couple hours of presentation before we jump in and have about an hour lunch break. And then in the afternoon, we'll jump into how to identify bumblebees here in the Pacific Northwest. What species should you encounter or will you encounter, and how will you identify them when you do? And then we'll sort of end at least the webinar portion of this with sort of an A to Z, like this is how you do a survey, this is how you plan a survey, these are the materials you need, these are the resources that are available. And then we'll go outside in the garden outside behind the visitor center here, and we'll actually practice some of the skills that we've talked about. And just for those of you that are watching online, Ross and I spent the day in the field yesterday doing a survey, and it was all recorded with a videographer there. So all of those, those skills, those field skills will be available online for you to watch probably by the end of the month. So give them a couple of weeks to edit that, but you'll be able to watch all of that training portion as well in a couple of weeks. Does anyone have any questions before we get started? Yes.
Will that video also be available to us?
Yeah, it'll just be on the website. Yep, it'll be on the website and on the Idaho Department of Fish and Wildlife website, or Fish and Game, sorry. So keep messing that up between Washington and Idaho. Ross, are there any online questions that have popped up that are worthwhile?
Well, I just disconnected, so.
Oh,
Because my computer died.
fantastic. So the one thing that I will try to do as you all ask questions, I think this microphone probably doesn't pick all of you up that well. I'll try to remember to repeat the question so that the people that are watching online can hear it. But reminders about that will be welcome, because I often forget in the moment. All right, well, let's get started. We're going to talk about a brief introduction about why this project is necessary and what pollination is and why we care so much about pollination, or why we should. So the question we've been asked by a number of people is, why do we need a Bumblebee Atlas? Why do we need this project? What are the goals for it? And Ross jumped into it a little bit. We have some species of concern and we need more information about them. But why are we doing it this way? Why aren't we doing it a more traditional way of going out and doing this? Well, the reality is we're all here in this room today, likely because of this animal. This is the European honeybee. And it is non-native to the United States. But in the early 2000s, this species started to go through some pretty rapid declines here. It was called colony collapse disorder. It's still going on. But the decline in the honeybee brought pollinator conservation and pollinator declines to the minds and to the press. And all of a sudden, people became aware of how important pollination was and how important bees were. So since the early 1990s, we've had a pretty significant decline in our managed animals, and we've also lost most of our feral honeybees. And the causes of those declines are many. Honey prices have meant that fewer and fewer people are going into honeybee management, but disease, pesticides, and pests have also caused declines in the honeybee industry. What most people don't know is that in addition to the honeybee, North America is home to at least 3,600 species of native bees. And not a single one of those native bees make honey. Okay, most of them don't live in colonies, they don't have queens, they don't have workers. It's a single animal living in a hole in the ground all by herself, going about doing her work. Most of these animals are small, the size of an ant, or maybe a little bit bigger. Most people probably wouldn't recognize them as bees, but we do have them. And the key to these bees is they are our insurance policy. If we have enough habitat on the ground, we know, a lot of research shows that these native bees can provide 100% of the pollination services that we need. And so we need our native bees. We need to have them on the landscape, pollinating our wildflowers, as well as our agricultural crops. And I am the Red List Authority for the International Union for the Conservation of Nature Bumblebee Specialist Group. And my goal, or our goal as a group, is to assess the extinction risk of all of the bumblebees in the world. There's around 250 species described right now. We've finished the work in North America, Central America, and South America. And what we've learned from that work is around a quarter of our bumblebees are facing some degree of extinction risk. So it's not just the honeybees that are declining. It is also a significant number of our native bees. Some work in Europe shows that as many as 40% of pollinators are in decline. Here in the Northwest, we have a number of species that are on this list of species that are in decline. Bombus franklini is probably the most significant of those. It's native to southern Oregon and northern California. It has not been seen since 2006 and is probably extinct. Bombus sucklei is one of the species that is on the Idaho SGCN list, the species of greatest conservation need list. Bombus crotchtii is a California species. Bombus caliginosus is an Oregon and Washington species. Bombus morrisoni is a Idaho species and on the SGCN list. Bombus occidentalis is a Idaho species, also on the SGCN list. And then Bombus pennsylvanicus is vulnerable. That's sort of native throughout North America. And Bombus fervidus is the last Idaho SGCN species. So all of these species are facing some degree of extinction risk. But if you look at a map of our current understanding of these species, you can notice that these dots pretty much map the human population, right? So we know where bumblebees are in Portland, in Seattle, and then in Boise, and all of the urban centers and along the roads throughout the Pacific Northwest. It's no surprise that people are collecting bees where they live and along roadsides, right? So that's where we know the most information. But there's a ton of empty space on this map where we have no idea what's going on. We have no idea what species live there, and we have no idea what resources they're using while we're there. So there's a huge gap in our understanding, and we need your help to help fill that gap to find out which species are thriving where. So the need is we know that some North American bumblebees are imperiled, but we don't have really clear distribution information. We have sort of gross understanding of what their ranges are, but when you start drilling down into ecoregions and different regions of the state, we don't really know what habitat associations are really important for these species of greatest conservation need. So what we've done is, as a team, we have broken the 3-state region up into 50-kilometer grid cells. And we selected those grid cells using historic bumblebee records as well as the different ecoregions of the states to try to get equal representation in those. And so these are the grid cells. The yellow and green grid cells are the ones that are available for adoption. The ones that are not, were not selected in a randomized process. As part of this grant, we agreed to sample 75% of the available grid cells in these 3 states. So that's why some of them are blank. There's a lot, and so one of the other things that we use is just accessibility. Excuse me. There are some places that are just very difficult to get to, and it wasn't realistic for us to expect citizen scientists to hike 25 miles to sample bumblebees. As fun as I think that would be to do, not everybody's necessarily up to that. So that's why we have the grid cells that are available. As many of you I know have adopted grid cells now, this map doesn't look like that anymore. There are a lot more yellow and red grid cells as people have adopted grid cells. I think we have had over 110 grid cells that have been adopted out of there's about 400 available. And as Ross mentioned, it's a 3-year project. So our goals, as Ross mentioned, are to really gather more information about bumblebee distribution. We also want to learn about habitat associations. And then here in Idaho, and actually also in Washington, we're going to apply what we've learned to actual on-the-ground management. We're going to be doing some restoration on wildlife management areas throughout the 2-state area, and actually apply some of what we learned on the ground, and then plant some of the flowers that bumblebees are using to try to increase and improve the habitat that's out there. And we'll continue to use that information as the state of Idaho and the state of Washington do restoration moving forward on these state and government-owned lands. So those are our goals. And then a lot of people, even if we get that far without people asking this question, then we're doing pretty good. But a lot of people don't understand why we want to conserve invertebrates at all. It's a question I get a lot. When I tell people that I work for the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, first of all, we have to get over a name that starts with X, which people really struggle with. And I've been told that I work for the Exorcist Society and many other interesting interpretations of how that's pronounced. But then invertebrate, most people think of invertebrates as sort of the slimy, stingy things in the world that just bother me, right? People don't want them in their house. They have people come and treat their yard and the outside of their homes and the inside of their homes to get rid of all the invertebrates. So why in the world would I want to spend my time conserving them, right? People don't really understand that. Well, there are many reasons why we would want to conserve invertebrates. One of them is just biodiversity. 85% of the world's biodiversity are invertebrates, right? 85%. If we just look at animals, over 90% of the world's biodiversity are invertebrates. So just from a biodiversity perspective, we should be conserving invertebrates. But if we were to look at which conservation organizations are working on which groups of animals, the majority of the conservation organizations out there are working on birds and mammals, which really make up a very small portion of the biodiversity on the planet. So there's a huge niche and importance from our work just from biodiversity. But then if we also look at ecosystem function, it's our invertebrates that are out there. They're all doing almost all of the decomposition. They're doing a lot of biocontrol. So they're reducing our need to use pesticides because they're controlling pests that are eating plants out there. They're the base of the food chain. They're feeding our salmon. They're feeding our songbirds. And they're also pollinating the crops that feed us, human beings, but they're also pollinating the plants that feed everything from songbirds to grizzly bears. The majority of grizzly bears are eating roots, nuts, seeds, and huckleberries, and all of those things are pollinated by bees. And so without bees, we get a pretty quickly, or without invertebrates, we would run into an ecosystem collapse pretty quickly. And so we're going to talk today about pollinators and mostly about bumblebees, but I am going to give you just sort of a pollination 101. I don't know how many of you are biology or remember your biology classes from high school or college. Probably a lot of you do, but perhaps some of you don't, but it's always good to remind ourselves. So we have flowering plant diversity because there are bees. 85% of the flowering plants on the planet are dependent on an animal for pollination services. And usually that animal is a bee. And pollination, what is pollination? It's basically an animal visits a flower. They get the male parts of the flower on their bodies. That's called pollen. And they move to another flower. And then the pollen, the male parts of the flower, get transferred to the female part of the flower, the stigma. And then the stigma grows pollen tubes basically through the style and then germinates or fertilizes the seeds that are in that flower, and then those seeds grow into fruits or nuts or seeds. So pollination is basically plant sex, right? It's how plants have sex. And without an animal to do that for them, plants would not be able to reproduce. So that's what pollination is, and that's why it matters. And from a human perspective, why do we care about pollination? Well, it's because we like to eat. Right, we partnered with Whole Foods a number of years ago, I think about 4 or 5 years ago now, just to help people understand what pollination does for us. This is what a Whole Foods produce department looks like on any given day. And they went through their produce department and removed all of the plants that were pollinated by bees for a couple of days just to help raise awareness about the situation. And that's what your produce department looks like without bees. Okay, so all of our most delicious fruits and vegetables start to disappear. We wouldn't starve, we wouldn't get scurvy. There's still some citrus out there that's self-pollinating, and a lot of greens aren't necessarily dependent on pollinators, but many of our most delicious and nutritious fruits and vegetables do disappear. Our berries, our apples, and a lot of other fruits that make living in the Pacific Northwest so wonderful, right? That's why we live here. That's part of the reason we live here. And so bees matter. And it's not just humans that they're feeding. I mentioned earlier, they're also feeding everything. They're pollinating the fruits and seeds that feed a lot of our wildlife. It's not just human beings. When we talk about pollination, usually it's invertebrates that are doing that pollination. Hummingbirds are also very important pollinators. We're not going to talk too much about them today, or actually that's probably the last time I'll mention hummingbirds. And in some cases, some mammals can be important pollinators, monkeys and bats. Here in the Northwest and pretty much in North America, we don't have any monkeys, so they're not doing any pollination for us, although people probably pollinate a little bit. And most of the bat pollination happens in the South, in Central America. There's some that happens in the desert Southwest, but here in the Northwest, I think all of our bats are insectivorous. They're eating insects and they're not pollinating. So the majority of pollination happens by insects. There are 6 main groups of pollinators: moths, flies, butterflies, wasps, beetles, and bees. And of these 6, bees are the best of the pollinators. Does anybody in here know why? Why are bees better than all of these other ones? Yeah.
They actively collect pollen
That's right. Why do they actively collect pollen?
for their kids.
Yeah. So bees are vegetarian. All they eat is pollen. That's basically the only food that they get except for nectar. It's their only source of protein. So bees are out in the landscape. They're actively covering their bodies with pollen on purpose. And then they bring that pollen back to their nest and they lay their eggs on it. And that's what their larvae are developing on. It's only pollen. All of those other 5 groups of animals, when they're visiting a flower, they're there just to drink the nectar. They want the sugar to basically be able to fly to the next flower or to be able to find a mate. They're not actively collecting and covering their bodies in pollen, which is what you see here on this bumblebee, right? You can see all those grains of pollen all over its body, and that's intentional. They're obviously not trying to pollinate plants when they do that. They're collecting it for themselves, but because they're covered in plants or covered in pollen, when they do visit plants, they are pollinating those plants much more efficiently than other. Someone must be drawing on the screen and I don't know who or how or why. It's a little eerie that it's red. But we can deal with it. That's all right. Red rum. So yeah, bees are pollinators because they're actively, or they're really good pollinators because they're actively collecting and moving pollen through the landscape. And sorry, yeah, no problem. Maybe stop. Ross, I think I can erase this. Sorry, everybody. All right, moving on. So yeah, the other thing that's great about bees as pollinators is they exhibit something called flower constancy, which means when they find a plant, they can get really efficient at removing the pollen from that plant, and then they visit that same species of plant again and again and again. And obviously, if you're a plant trying to reproduce, you want your pollen to go to a plant of the same species, not to a different species. Since those other animals are just chasing nectar around, they tend to flirt between different species of plants pretty regularly. And I mentioned earlier, yes?
Just one question. So when they're carrying pollen, they can either carry it in these pollen baskets or whatever, or they can just coat themselves with it and shake it off of themselves when they get.
Yeah, there's many different methods of carrying pollen around for bees. Most of them have what are called corbicula, or the name of the pollen basket is corbicula, but for some reason the name of the other pollen carrying mechanism is scopa. So they either have scopa or corbicula on their legs, and there's a whole family of animals that have scopa on the underside of their abdomen. So they're usually grooming it to either their legs or their abdomen. Just sort of, some of them also just naturally aren't great pollen groomers, and they do just end up covering their whole bodies in pollen. There's also a group of bees called Hylaeus, yellow-faced bees, and they actually eat pollen and then regurgitate it, so they don't carry pollen on the outside of their bodies. So there's a lot of different ways that bees carry. With 3,600 species, there are just so many different life histories. It's hard to generalize, but there's a lot of interesting biology out there. So I mentioned earlier, there's a huge amount of native bee diversity in North America. I know we're here to talk about bumblebees, but I feel like it's a really unique opportunity for many of you who may not know this to sort of see some of these animals and get an appreciation for the diversity of pollinators that are out there. So this is North America's smallest bee, Perdita minima, on the face of North America's largest bee, which is a carpenter bee in the genus Xylocopa. So this bee is about 2.5 millimeters, and this bee is, you know, close to 2 inches or 1.5 inches in length. So huge diversity in size. But when most people think about a bee, they do think about honeybees. And this, from a conservation perspective, this is a problem because most bees aren't anything like honeybees. They don't live in colonies, they don't make honey, they don't live through the winter, they hibernate. And so when we think about how, you know, management affects bees, if we're just thinking about honeybees, we're missing a lot of the picture. And that's also true about pesticides. All of our insecticides are only ever tested on honeybees, but honeybees process food so much differently than all of the other native bees. We have no idea how insecticides are really affecting our native bees because it's not part of the testing process. But here is sort of what I like to call a few minutes of eye candy, where I'm just going to show you pictures of native bees from North America. This is the rusty patch bumblebee, which is a species native to sort of from North Dakota to Maine and then down through Georgia. This species was actually just added to the endangered species list last year. This is a metallic green sweat bee in the genus Agapostemon. I'm sure you have these in your backyard. They're everywhere. Yeah. This is another Perdita, or no, this is a Holocapodes, sorry. This is a cuckoo bee. Cuckoo bees don't collect their own pollen. They use the nests of other bees. So they're flying around looking for other bees. This is a longhorn bean in the genus Svastra. These are sunflower specialists. It's another native bee that this is a male Megachilidae. You can see all those hairs on its front legs there and huge mandibles for, these are leaf cutter bees for cutting leaves. There's a bumblebee, Bombus Silicola, I think. It's a Halictus, 2 halictids there, green metallic and sweat bee. There's another metallic green bee, not in the genus Agapostemon. These are a little rarer than the Agapostemon. Another bumblebee. That's Bombus centralis, native to Idaho. There's another cuckoo bee, genus Nomata. And then there's a Andrina, a mining bee. And then there's a leafcutter bee bringing a cut of leaf back to its nest. And so we just looked at a bee about every 3 seconds or so. And if we were to look at all of North America's bees, we would be here for an hour just looking at photos at that rate. And then to look at all the bees of the world, we would be here for 24 hours straight, just looking at photos at that rate to see all this of the 20,000 species of bees in the world. So hopefully that gives you just some appreciation for the diversity. There are 5, they come from 5 different families, and there are more different life histories and biology than we could possibly describe here in a day. But it's important to realize that what we're studying and learning about really only represents 1.4% of North America's bees, right? So this huge conservation effort that we're doing is really only working on a small slice of the bees that are in North America. That doesn't mean that we're not helping all of those other bees. All this land management that we're doing is going to be helping all these other species. But it's important to realize we're only working on really a small, narrow group of the diversity in North America. Ross, do you know how to get rid of this bar?
You can move it with your
Oh, I can?
scroll over and pull it up.
Yeah, just grab onto it and drag it over to
Here, I see.
to the right.
Or you can go all the way to the top.
Yeah, if you drag it over to the right, it'll switch over and go.
There we go.
So there you go.
That's good. Okay. Sorry, that was really bugging me. All right. So now I think we're going to go to bumblebees. Except my cursor now is probably on that. There we go. So there's different life histories, basically, of the three main groups. There's a bunch of bees that nest directly in the ground, in holes in the ground. There are what we call tunnel nesting bees that are nesting in cavities above the ground. These are our leafcutter bees and our other mason bees that people are familiar with, and then our bumblebees. So in terms of a solitary bee life cycle, the majority of these 3,600 species, we see them as adults, but the majority of their life is spent underground. This is what their nests look like, sort of coming down through the soil. There's some pollen, and then they lay their egg directly on the pollen. This is what a bee larvae looks like. They go through complete metamorphosis, so they start as a worm, and then they end up as a winged adult. There's the pupae, when they're in their pupae phase, and then they spend some time as a winged adult reproducing, mating, and then repeating the process. Yes?
If you accidentally, like you're gardening, and you accidentally disrupt one of them, if you cover it back up, will it recover?
They'll dig back up through it if it's loose soil. Yeah, they're pretty good at that. This is an example of a ground nest. They can be up to 1 meter deep, and they're usually a single entrance hole, and they come down and often have many sort of chambers off of that single entrance hole. This is what the nests often look like on the surface of the ground. These are called tumuli. They're little bits of dirt that have basically been dug out by the bee and spilled over on the side of the ground. They kind of look like little shield volcanoes. And then here's a mining bee right next to one of those holes. The variety of soils that they nest in is hugely varied, everything from sandy loam to clay soils. And there was actually a species in Arizona that was discovered that actually digs its nests in sandstone just a couple years ago. It was a brand new species. So huge diversity of substrates. And then we have our above ground tunnel nesting bees that are nesting in often pithy stemmed plants that they hollow out or directly into wood, sometimes in bark beetle holes. Sometimes they'll actually go under the clapboards of your house or in reeds or other plants like that. And then our bumblebees, we're going to go into the bumblebee life cycle a little bit later. They're a little bit different. They do have a worker caste, so queens overwinter in the ground. They emerge and found a nest. Once they've reproduced and they have a couple of offspring, those workers are doing all of the work while the queen stays in the nest. And then in the fall, the queens mate and then repeat the process. So we'll go over that in a little bit more detail since we're talking about bumblebees. But just talking generally about the different lifestyles that are out there. So ground nesting bees represent around 2/3 of our species. 1/3 are these above ground tunnel nesting bees, and then bumblebees are 2% or 1.5% of our native bees. So we talked a little bit about honeybee declines earlier. Everyone's always asking me, what is colony collapse disorder? What caused these declines? The reality is there's no smoking gun. I don't think there's ever going to be a smoking gun. It's a kind of straw that broke the camel's back situation. There's lots of things going on in the landscape that are causing honeybees to decline. Diseases, being moved all over the country, pesticides, habitat loss, you name it. It's basically going on out there. The reality is we don't know that much about our native bees. Because they're just a single animal living in a hole in the ground, they're very hard to study, and very few people have done sort of population level studies to figure out what's going on in them. But I mentioned earlier, we do know from some work that's been done in Europe and other places that as many as 40% of pollinator species may be at some risk of extinction. And because of these land management issues and the size of their nests and the size of their bodies, they do face unique risks out in the landscape. I showed you this earlier, that 1/4 of our bumblebees are facing some degree of extinction risk. And the first bumblebee was added to the endangered species list in 2017. So we know there are some pretty significant declines out there, and there's a huge diversity of species. But from our perspective, the good thing is that means there are lots of opportunities for conservation, right? I'm going to try not to depress you today as we talk about this. We'll try to end on, there are a lot of positive things that you can do for pollinators. And I think it's actually one of the great things about pollinator conservation in general is there's something that you can do in your backyard. Obviously, by helping us with the Atlas project, you'll be helping conservation. But if you put habitat in your backyard, you will notice pollinators showing up almost immediately. And it's one of the rare conservation opportunities where you can do something and see an immediate effect. Question?
Yeah, so you were saying that rusty patch bumblebee is the first listed species. What about the Franklin's bumblebee? Is that just because it's assumed to be extinct now, it's not listed? Or? Good
question. So the question was, the rusty patch bumblebee has been added to the endangered species list. Why not Franklin's bumblebee? I don't know the answer to that question. The Fish and Wildlife Service, we petitioned Franklin's bumblebee well before we petitioned the rusty patch bumblebee. They're actually actively reviewing Franklin's bumblebee right now. So it's very possible it could get added to the endangered species list in the near future. As to why they didn't review it previously, I don't know the answer to that question. They have funding constraints and priority constraints, and as far as I understand, the Fish and Wildlife Service has a whole lot more work than they can possibly do with the people they have on the ground and the funding they have. And they made a choice not to assess it, but I don't know any better than that. But they are actively reviewing Franklin's bumblebee now, and a few other species, the western bumblebee and the yellow-banded bumblebee as well. So there's 3 species that are currently under endangered species consideration. All right, that's the end of our introduction. Does anyone have any questions? Another question?
One more.
Yeah.
Quick
No, it's
one.
fine. It's
So,
great. It's great.
You were talking about above ground nesting and ground nesting bees, and where do bumblebees fall? Are they both? Or?
Yeah, good question. So question is, where do bumblebees nest? The majority, it's often assumed that bumblebees nest underground, or that most species nest underground. They're often associated with abandoned rodent holes, or seen, sort of flying out of small holes in the ground. But they also nest in old abandoned bird nests, in compost piles. They're opportunistic, rock walls. So, and some species will actually nest just directly on the surface of the ground, like under thatched bunch grasses and things like that. So anywhere with a little bit of shelter. So it's a great reason for you to be lazy in your yard. If you leave some unmowed grass and some brush piles, if your neighbors get upset, you can say, hey man, it's pollinator